Live from Texas. I'm your co host, Charlie, with my buddy here and co host.
This is Andre coming at you from the great state of Maryland. Welcome to another episode of the Andre and Charlie podcast. We are going to change it up a little bit today and do something different. This may seem like a bit of a random topic since we've been talking about Star Wars, Tolkien, and just DC life, but we do all things geek and nerd and kind of take a deep dive into different topics here. So one thing that's been of interest to us both for a little while in our historical exploration has been the Roman Empire, and specifically the Byzantine Empire, given that we were both born Orthodox Christians. I have background in Romania, Greece, Italy. Charlie has background partly in Greece as well. So this has been a kind of a cool thing to explore lately. We decided to do a little episode on the life and times of the most famous Byzantine emperor, none other than Justinian the First. He's very well known and he's often lauded, but can be a very controversial figure in history. So we'll take you through a rundown of his reign, his exploits, his conquests, the drama that happened with he and his wife, and hopefully it should be a exciting journey. Here we go.
Yeah, Justinian's a cool guy. I mean, he has a lot of interesting conceptions in his history. A lot of it really relates to the modern day. He dealt with riots in the capital city. He dealt with wars to the east, specifically with like the Sassanid Persians. And then he had wars to the west of his empire in Italy. And he also had to deal with a lot of excessive religious issues at the time, but at the same time it was kind of a renaissance because he sort of provided a type of restoration to the empire, provided a legal code, and had far-reaching ramifications. That Corpus Juris Civilis is simply incredible. I have a quote actually pulled up that's attributed to Justinian but found in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which is basically the basis of all civil law existing. Justice is the constant and perpetual wish to render to everyone his due. Justia est constas est perpetua voluntas uniquique sumo dubrere.
Oh, very cool. And as we all know, yes, that is the basis for, I believe, so basically what he did was, this may be skipping ahead a little bit chronologically, but he decided to take existing Roman law that was kind of gradually established over many preceding centuries and codify it into a unified sort of set of laws and standard. And then I believe that was also the inspiration for later, like the Napoleonic Code and various others that we have in the modern world, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, basically, there certainly have been, localities, Germanic, Nordic law, English law, but a lot of, and law developed in France, but a lot of these countries basically took the code of Justinian and just transplanted it over to their locality.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting, what you said about the development of law, is that we see the civil code as kind of contrasted to the common law, that is to say, judge-made law. But really, the civil code of Justinian is like the outgrowth of common law, as in judge-made law. And then they just codified what the rules were that the judges had made. So it's kind of this interesting thing that common law made civil law, and then civil law is now seen as the contrary position to common law.
Common law, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, he must have, assembled Camelot basically of scholars, and
exactly.
It must have been a really.
It was a massive undertaking. I mean, it really, and at the time, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, more accurately, was still able to, it still had the funds to be able to gather all of these, scribes and scholars and experts and judges and jurists from all across the empire to actually, compile this massive undertaking. So it really was, a pretty uh, phenomenal, astounding accomplishment, I think, of the age.
And that's one of the main reasons, not the only one, of course, but one of the main reasons he's so famous.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, just to give you a brief rundown, people who might not be familiar with the Byzantine Empire.
Also known as the Roman Empire.
It is the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which is often ascribed to the year 476 AD, although taking a deeper, closer look, that is somewhat arbitrary, but that is the day that the last legitimate Western emperor was deposed by a Germanic general. And in the decades after the Eastern Roman Empire still stayed strong and maintained its power from Constantinople over the eastern half. It was always more wealthy, especially after the founding of Constantinople. And what was interesting is that it was predominantly a Greek-speaking region. That area of the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire was predominantly always Greek-speaking, although Latin was the administrative language. And Latin would remain the language of administration in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire until the early 7th century or 600s under the Emperor Heraclius, at which point it became Greek in the administrative records as well. And I think part of the reason for that was actually because by that point, half a century later, they had begun to lose a lot of the territories where people spoke Latin anyway, so they were like, we might as well just make it Greek, since that's what most of us speak, especially in Constantinople. Justinian himself, to give you some background, he was actually a native Latin speaker from he was one of the native Romanized people of the Balkans. I believe he was born in a town that's now in northern Macedonia near Serbia, actually. Some kind of Thracian origin, I believe. But yeah, he spoke Latin, as did his family. He came to power in the early 500s because his uncle Justin became emperor and succeeded the throne after the really old emperor Anastasius died. Justin did not really do too much. He was a pretty chill emperor overall. He came from a pretty humble background. He was a swineherd, actually, and he had this crazy, rise to power that no one really saw. But it just goes to show you things like that were possible back then. And basically, while his uncle was emperor for a brief reign of 7 years, he was really for the last few years kind of running the show anyway, and really spending all his life and time for this role of being emperor and changing the empire and making it how he wanted. And I guess we can go into how he met his wife around this time before he actually became emperor. Her name was Theodora. She is a controversial figure, to say the least.
Yeah, big time.
She was said to have been a actress, but back then this profession carried the connotation. Sometimes it was understood that it might have meant prostitute, or at least some kind of escort of sorts. But this isn't completely certain, but that's what the speculation is, that she came from low birth anyway. But
Well, if I may say,
yeah.
I have like an email I sent to a professor of Byzantine studies. I've sent this to you. This is what I wrote to him. Procopius seems to be an interesting source. Procopius wrote like this book called The Secret History.
Yeah, he's basically our whole
yeah.
source for Justinian's life.
uh, in addition to like maybe archaeological evidence that we can find of like battles. But anyway,
Yeah.
Procopius seems to be an interesting source because he appears to write an alternative history compared to the official history. It's troubling that the church would canonize such figures as the emperor and empress who engaged in such activities. But I suppose this is one of the key debates about the validity of Procopius's account. Here's what I found out in a footnote to the 1911 edition of Britannica. The authors of the Britannica article indicate that there is both evidence for Procopius's account and against his account. So there's an interesting footnote to her life that says that kind of goes into this debate. So I think it's interesting. It was, it like you said, it's very debatable. But even the 1911 edition of Britannica seems to actually, the footnote is really long. It's very interesting how it can be debated. So I thought I might bring that in a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, you have to take a lot of things with a grain of salt because Procopius, he was rather biased. He was from Caesarea. He worked under the employ of the emperor, and while during the life of Justinian, he sang his praises and lauded him all the time because that was kind of his job, and he also worked with his top general Belisarius. But he wrote his secret history in secret because he really
Right.
actually kind of hated the royal couple, and it's very clear through the kind of vitriol he writes about them and his tone in the writing. Back then, historians were not necessarily objective in the way that they're expected to be now. They're kind of in the heat of it, and a lot of the events that he talks about, he was actually somewhat implicated in himself, which is obviously that
Mm-hmm.
creates bias, but also makes for an interesting story, an interesting take in a way that more detached, armchair historians today do not really, get. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt, but it's
I
interesting.
mean, professors like Anthony
Caldelis, yeah.
Cal- Caladelis, yeah, Chicago. He seems to have an even-handed account. Just suggesting a source that others might be interested in looking up.
Yeah.
Um,
There
and
were
you were
other
doing that
sources.
podcast as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, some of the inspiration for this was the great podcast, The History of Byzantium, which is still ongoing.
Right.
But we wanted to take a look at this topic from more of just, a assessing his reign and merits and discussing like the cultural kind of resonance of this time period.
Right.
But yeah, I guess while we're on the topic of Procopius, he also generally had, like, you could tell, a thing against like these ambitious women of the day.
Yeah.
He not only
Yeah.
implied that Theodora was the way she was, but also Antonina, her friend, who was the wife of Belisarius, also did not have good things to say about her, saying she was also a woman of loose morals. Um,
But there's a certain veracity to Belisarius's account, at least ostensibly, because he was present. He was there when Justinian was going out to war. He was there, I think, at the Nika riots, right?
yeah,
When
yeah,
Justinian was nearly like he was encircled inside the palace by
exactly.
angry protesters.
So, just to give some more background, early in his reign, one of the main defining events was this thing called the Nika riots. So, in
Mm,
the Constantinople, formerly known as Byzantium, there was a huge chariot racing sort of arena or stadium called the Hippodrome, where they would
Hippodrome.
race chariots, and um, there was this fierce competition between the blues and the greens, and like huge crowds gathered to root for them in the way that they would their favorite football team or whatever. But they got really, really into it. To the point where there were like gangs and mobs that backed each side, and there was like all kinds of corruption,
Yeah.
drama associated with all this. Justinian generally tried to be neutral, but I think he was originally associated with one side, but then he tried to stay neutral. there was some kind of fighting between them that broke out, and then he cracked down on them, and then he decided to try to hang some of the perpetrators of these blues and greens, but
Right.
I think like the scaffolding broke, and then they sought pardon, but he didn't really give it to them, and um, I think like the crowd then turned against him because of the way he was so harsh and trying to crack down on the on this
Right. Right. You can sort
unrest.
of
Yeah,
you can sort of imagine just really intense soccer fans,
yeah, exactly. Like
FC Barcelona
English
or
soccer
FC,
fans, especially like
yeah,
the British hooligan
Manchester
types. Yeah,
or
yeah.
Chelsea, and they're going at it. There was even a brief conflict between El Salvador and Honduras in 1969 called the Football War that was
Oh wow.
ostensibly about like FIFA World Cup qualifier event, but really it was about, political
Yeah,
tensions
of
underneath
course,
there.
as they
So you
often
can
are.
see how sports and such can sometimes intermingle. I mean,
Yeah.
even during the Cold War, the U.S. Sports teams were very monumental to the U.S. when they compete, especially against Russia. And in the U.S. it was very common for people to say like, "Oh, I'm really rooting, and it's a big win that we beat the Soviets and
Yeah.
running or
There's
swimming
a
or
lot running
yeah,
on it, right? Like
yeah,
it's like basically a proxy for a cultural war. Yeah.
right, right, right,
So, yeah, these riots broke out. Then, like the first time, like they started chanting against Justinian, basically suggesting to be down with him, like kill him. And then he got
yeah.
really freaked out and paranoid, and basically asked his army and his soldiers stationed there to start killing them. And it ended pretty badly. There was about 30,000 civilians killed in this crush in the Hippodrome.
Yeah,
So needless to say, not a great start to his reign, but he did keep power. There's an
yeah,
interesting
yeah.
quote from his wife, like said, because he was planning on like leaving, in fear, but like his wife was like, "No, we don't do that. We stand here and we die if we must." Because I think she even said like poetically, like the royal purple makes a great burial shroud or something like that. The
Mm,
most noble
interesting.
shroud. So
She was there with him and Belisarius, right? This
yeah, she was
Narcissus,
kind of
right?
a boss lady, a boss bitch, I would say. Like she was really
Yeah, yeah,
kind
yeah. I
of
mean, she came from humble origins, right?
yeah, but they were basically like one of the first power couples of history. Like they were almost on equal footing. Like
Or at least
Theodora,
comparable to like Caesar and
oh, and
Cleopatra, right?
Cleopatra, but I wouldn't even say they were that. Like Justinian and Theodora had a certain like synergy that worked for like many decades in a way that did.
Okay, unlike Cleopatra, yeah, it
Yeah,
wasn't
that was more
just
of just like
short
a
lived. Yeah.
torrid kind of love affair, and partly, I think, manipulation. Than
Well, I mean, Cleopatra went down fighting with
yeah, and then Mark Antony and
Mark Antony.
yeah. But
That's pretty wild, right?
oh yeah, but
And I mean, I guess Theodora was about to go down fighting, right?
she was, but she lasted a lot longer. But yeah, she
Yeah.
was very influential to a lot of her husband's decisions throughout his reign. And anyway, so yeah,
The
that's that
Nika
dynamic.
riots.
So the
There
next
was
big
also a
thing.
plague.
Oh
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah. We'll get to that in a little bit. So
Okay.
then he decided to. There's some trouble brewing in Italy, which was no longer under Roman control; it was under the Gothic control. In which they had like a ruler there who was somewhat, friendly to Rome and its influence until another one came, an heir came or deposed the other that was not as friendly, and then Justinian used as a pretext to kind of invade Italy. Actually, first he decided to. Well, I kind of skipped ahead. First, there was trouble in the east in Persia. He
Right.
sent his best general Belisarius to defeat them, and he won as he would throughout most of his career against numerically superior foes. I believe this is the Battle of Dara in the east, so he kind of took
Mhm.
care of the Eastern Front, and then he decided to reclaim the province of Africa, which was lost like 70 something years before. which was then owned by the Vandals. The Vandals were like a German, like Germanic people originally from like Scandinavia, northern Germany, who had migrated all the way to North Africa of all places, which is kind of this bizarre, trek and journey. But they established a kingdom there and ruled for quite a while. But
Right.
sent Belisarius over there. They defeated them at the Battle of Ad Decimum, defeated the King Gelimer. They,
Right. King
yeah,
Gelimer. Yeah. Very
Gelimer.
like kind of Germanic name.
Yeah, there was some like I think there was some religious tension as well because those were Arian Christians. They were a different
Mm.
sect of early Christianity than the main Orthodox kind of church. Um, so
And they were based around Carthage, right? Like the fighting took place around the main
yeah, the
historic city
last
of
battle was
Carthage,
basically the Battle of Carthage. Yeah, yeah, because they took over Carthage at that time. So
Carthago.
yep. And then there's like a rebellion and then they quelled it. And then basically they reestablished Africa as a province. Basically it's now like Tunisia and Libya,
Right.
Algeria, that kind
I
of
mean, essentially, Carthage is Tunis of
yeah,
Tunisia, right?
more or
Yeah.
less, more or less. Um so then Belisarius, after he won that, I think there was some issue where like a lot of his fleet got sick on the sea, but his wife,
Oh, that's right.
yeah,
I heard that Belisarius was really intense with his soldiers. Like there were
soldiers,
some
yeah.
people messing around and he hung them before they sailed out.
It was all
And he
about
says
discipline.
he was very much about discipline. He said
Yeah.
something like, if you don't follow the rules, this is what's going to happen to you.
But he was a pretty honorable man overall and a good soldier, especially compared, I think, to Justinian as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a big debate about that, right?
Yeah, yeah. But so he yeah, they sailed then to Italy and invaded through like the boot of Italy and Sicily. And
Mm-hmm.
I think they fairly quickly took out some of the Goths and like took Rome and like they besieged it and took it.
Right.
Then like this is like in the 530s AD, like, and then he was recalled back home. This is an interesting little like segment here. So Belisarius had grown so popular with his men and done all these conquests almost essentially independently, even though it was under Justinian, that his men they basically offered him like a kingship of sorts, like separately from the Emperor Justinian. They would offer him to be like
That's
king of
crazy. And he
Italy or
didn't take it,
Africa,
right?
but he didn't take it. No, he was a loyal servant to the crown to the empire, the emperor in Constantinople, and did not. Um, but Justinian, he saw that his popularity was gaining, and he was like actually jealous and decided to recall him, just at the moment of his triumph. And then sent him to some other theater of war for a little while. In the meantime, the Goths began, coming back to power in Italy and undid a lot of his conquests. So,
Theodoric, the famous Theodoric, right?
well, that was a little bit after him, but yeah. I think it was the King Vidiges, and then King Totila was the last Gothic king who tried to undo
Totila
some
and
of Belisarius'
Vidigas.
conquest. Um, so then basically Justinian was like, well, all right, I realize you're my best general. There's no getting around it. I see that you're loyal to me. Can you please go back to Italy and clean up and do it right this time? And we'll hold on to it, basically. And he did that. But the war this time was a lot longer and harder, and a lot of people died. It kind of dragged on for
Yeah.
like more than a decade. Rome was besieged, and Belisarius did this epic like defense of it in winter. And
Rome kind of exchanged hands a few times, right?
yeah, definitely. And it's
Yeah, during that
unfortunate, but
time.
like I think many historians think that this war did more damage to Italy and ending sort of like the classical Roman era in some ways than the actual barbarian invasions, like
That's interesting. I
yeah.
was reading this book called The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt. I think it got the Pulitzer Prize, but he was saying that there used to be bookstores all throughout Rome and
Yeah.
people were avid readers until the Goths came over and started burning everything, and people were more worried about, day-to-day life rather than their books. And I
Huh.
think he brings up a really interesting point. I mean, but I guess I wonder, I don't know if the book I don't think the book really went into much detail because it was more about something in relation to like Lucretius's poem on the nature of things, De Rerum Natura. But I wonder if this was what really destroyed like classical Rome, this war
Yeah,
here.
it's debate because like like the old narrative blames it on the Germanic barbarians and whatnot. But to be honest, Justinian was just as complicit in some ways, even though his aim was to reconquer it. He did it in such a brutal, way that it ended up destroying a lot of it, reducing its population greatly, and
So
basically,
the real losers were the people living
yeah, the
there.
Romans, the Italians, and then it also paved the way for the Lombards to quickly afterward eventually take
Mm.
a lot of Italy anyway. So it was a bit of a period. I mean, not a very long lasting victory.
Let
Um,
me let me ask you this. Do you know if there's a large population exchange? Like, let's say you're a wealthy Roman nobleman at the fall of Rome or during this time period, and you're living there. Would you would was there like a mass migration of the wealthy nobility to like the Eastern Roman Empire, or
there was some, I think, and some happened, after 476, after the fall of the Western one. Um, Especially a lot of
because
the
it's curious that Justinian spoke Latin. Was
well,
that
see,
common in the
so
Eastern Empire?
no, not so the area north of a certain point in the Balkans, like starting with like Macedonia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and that area, did always speak Latin, or not always, but as long as the Roman Empire was in the area, they became
Mm-hmm.
Latinized. In the area south and east of that, like Greece, Anatolia, the Near East, Egypt, that was Greek speaking. And like the reason to the north of that line, the languages eventually evolved into like Romanian, for example, and various other dialects of it. That was
What
like,
about Bulgarian?
huh?
But Bulgarian isn't related to Latin, is it?
No, no, no. I'm saying like in the area that is now Bulgaria, there was Latin spoken all around there until later the Slavs came and
Right.
changed that, but it survived in pockets, which eventually became Romanian and then Dalmatian a little further to the west on the Adriatic.
Why were so the Slavs made it south to Bulgaria, but why were they unable to, like, why did they skip Romania? I guess is my question.
That's a much more complicated question. Perhaps we can say that for a different episode.
Was it sort of related to geography where they could sort of maintain a stronghold in Romania as compared to like
It's
Bulgaria?
that's one theory. One theory is that they survived in little pockets in the mountains and forests and were isolated. Another competing theory is that Romanian actually came from south of the Danube in an area that was longer under Latin control and then only moved across the river later in the Middle Ages. Um, it's kind of an intense debate. And anyway,
Interesting. All right. Well, maybe
yeah,
thoughts for another podcast.
yeah. That's a whole nother
Okay.
question. I could,
All right. So we're
but
kind of are we wrapping up the Gothic War? And
yeah.
you
So
said
the
they opened
Gothic
up the
War is
way for the
basically
Lombards.
yeah. The Gothic War is over. Also during this time, interestingly, he sent Justinian sent another expedition to reconquer the south of Spain from the
Mm,
Visigoths. So in Italy there were the Ostrogoths. In Spain there were the Visigoths. They're cousins, both Germanic tribes. Um, and they turned this into the province of Spania, which is kind of an interesting little far-flung western province that lasted for about 70 years. And there were some, Byzantine influences in there. Um, and also some parts of North Africa. So basically, he reconquered a lot of the Mediterranean, including like Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, Sicily, all that. Um, and well, here's around the time when shit really started going south because the plague hit. This crept out
right.
of nowhere. It supposedly came from like Egypt, somewhere in a port down there, but I read that scientists ultimately say that this strain of plague was actually of the same kind, the Yersinia pestis that caused the Black Plague much later in the Middle Ages. and ultimately might have come from somewhere in like Mongolia or Central Asia, and was like spreading with like kind of the movement of people in the migration like era.
Would
Uh,
you say rats were the
yeah,
issue?
it was fleas on rats which carried, this illness which would cause people to break out in these like disgusting, like pustulant sores, called buboes, I think. Yeah.
The
So
plague of Justinian. So
yeah, they
very
call it the
relevant
plague
to
of
our
Justinian.
times.
Hmm?
A massive plague making everybody sick.
Yeah, this is like 541 or something like that, AD. And yeah, it really devastated a lot of the Eastern Roman population. I believe even Justinian himself caught it, but he survived, luckily. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and it really weakened. I mean, it made a lot of these wars and this overextension militarily much harder to maintain because you had people dying everywhere. So
Yeah, I've read theories that it maybe came from China, it maybe came from Sub-Saharan Africa,
yeah, like
and it
Ethiopia and
even
whatnot.
extended, like they found like evidence of it on skeletons in Germany.
Yeah, it went pretty far, and some say it even reaches as far as Britain in some ways, especially like the Welsh population there. But
It's interesting how much, we think of the medieval world or the world outside the Roman Empire as sort of like unconnected, but obviously these people must have communicated somehow,
oh
right?
yeah, yeah, the Europe was more connected at the time than was thought. I mean, this is sort of the beginning of the Dark Ages in some ways, but the Mediterranean was still, pretty populated and had,
And then there's that
yeah.
famous volcanic winter of like
Yes, this is like
536.
around the same time in the 530. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I heard that volcanic eruption, the cloud cover it caused, actually caused the plague in some indirect way to spread further because it was like colder temperatures a little bit, and that caused the flea to, uh, transmit the bacteria in like in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise, I believe. I'm
Yeah,
not familiar with the biological
interesting. They called
details,
it like a
but
little ice age of antiquity or
yeah,
something.
yeah, there was like a little ice
Yeah.
age in late antiquity. Yeah. Um, so yeah, you had a lot of stuff going on. Now the plague did a number on the empire. Um, Justinian did not handle that the best, I think, but there's not that much that they really could have done about it, to be fair. He also had a lot of he was trying to bring together the different sects of early Christianity that were at odds with each other. He was like
Right.
Orthodox, but there were these people called the Monophysites or Miaphysites who believed in like the idea that Jesus only had one uh form, like it wasn't the Trinity in which it was the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, but they were all kind of encompassed into one entity, essentially. We could get into the theological kind of
It's
uh
interesting how many like different theories and religions, kind of existed at that time.
especially
You'd
among
mentioned
Christianity,
Arianism. Yeah, yeah,
because they couldn't really get their act straight and decide like what Jesus was, what God was exactly. And there's a lot of debate. The Greeks, like, they kind of brought in a lot of philosophy into it, and
right,
it's
right.
complicated, theology. It's interesting how like theology kind of replaced what used to be classic, Athenian, philosophy and whatnot. uh
I mean, it's worth speaking of religion. It's worth noting that the Eastern Orthodox Church kind of venerates him. I don't know if I think they venerate him as a saint, but strangely enough, Lutheranism venerates him, but Catholicism does not.
yeah, yeah, it's
It's
true.
pre-schism too.
And I think interestingly, I think Dante in his Inferno, he mentions Justinian in a positive light as like a spirit, with law and justice, not as
Well, to confirm, the Paradiso Inferno was the
right.
hell.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's
The
right.
Paradiso he sees Justinian in heaven.
Yeah, which is
Yeah,
interesting because I personally do not think he's a good guy overall. I mean, he did a lot of the Nika riots, the way he handled Belisarius, who was a loyal officer, kind of
right.
dragging him around, the way the plague was handled.
Well, if I may say, what's interesting about the Paradiso is that it sort of replicates the spheres of heaven.
Mm.
He's in the sphere of Mercury, and
Yeah.
that's a whole nother conversation. As Mercury being the morning star,
Oh
in
yeah,
classical
the morning
mythology.
star.
So
Mercury
anyway,
or Venus, the day star. Yeah, that's
right, right.
um but yeah, so overall, reception of him is mixed. And I think like his overextension militarily actually cost the empire more in the coming decades with the Lombards and Avars and such. And you can say in some ways this would even weaken it against the Persians in the early part of the next century, and then ultimately, of course, the Arabs, who kind of undid a lot of their conquests and would go on to basically take the North African and Middle Eastern parts of their empire, aside from Anatolia, which fundamentally changed the rest of the trajectory of Byzantine history. But for now, let's wrap up part one of this topic, and we will continue this on another date. Thanks for joining us on the Charlie and Andre podcast. Stay tuned.